a sudden and transient surge of fear accompanied by the physical and psychological symptoms on the slide behind me. And these attacks are the defining feature of panic disorder. This is a common anxiety disorder, particularly in young people, with 3.4% of 17 to 19-year-olds meeting diagnostic criteria. Now, this percentage might sound small, but when you account for the population of the UK, this gives around 135 individuals in this age range living with panic disorder. So that's enough people to fill the O2 Arena more than 6 times over. It's equal to the capacity of about 1,200 double-decker buses, and it's enough students to fill around 5,000 classrooms. According to Clarke's cognitive model, at the core of panic attacks that occur in the context of panic disorder is a catastrophic misinterpretation of these symptoms, the belief that they indicate an imminent physical or mental catastrophe. So let's imagine a teenager in a classroom. All of a sudden, they notice one of these triggers for a panic attack, and this can be something as simple as feeling a bit detached or spaced out, a little bit disconnected from themselves. And this causes a thought to pop up in their head. They wonder what's happening to them, whether they're losing control. And the more these thoughts escalate, the more anxious they feel. They start to notice the physical symptoms of anxiety, so their heart's racing, their legs feel weak. And these feelings fuel that catastrophic belief. Maybe those symptoms are a sign that they are in fact losing control. Everything is spiraling and something bad is happening to their body and mind. And to make things even worse, they're sat in a classroom and they're surrounded by their friends. They worry about other people noticing that they're panicking, so they try to suppress their feelings and catastrophic thoughts. But the more they do this, the worse those symptoms get. As the panic attack escalates, the young person might leave the room to calm down, and apprehensive about having another attack, they might avoid that classroom in the future. This avoidance of a feared situation or feeling is a kind of safety behaviour. It's a natural response to something stressful, and it's what we do to make ourselves feel safer when we encounter a threat. But avoidance and other safety behaviours in general actually feed anxiety disorders in the long term. Because if you never challenge that distorted belief, you'll never learn that it's not true. So you'll never learn that you can face this thing that you're scared of, so in our example, a feeling of being detached from yourself, and that over time that anxiety will pass on its own. Panic symptoms actually exist on a continuum, and they're not only experienced by that small percentage who meet the clinical threshold for a diagnosis of panic disorder. In fact, over 60% of adolescents in the general population report experiencing at least one panic attack in the past year. So on the left of the continuum on the slide is where we would place young people who experience none or very few panic symptoms. And as we move further along, those symptoms become more frequent and severe, until we reach the far right-hand side, which is where we would place that 3.4% of individuals with a diagnosis of panic disorder. And one of the features that separates people who experience a few panic attacks every now and again to those who have panic disorder is anticipatory anxiety, a persistent worry about having a future attack or its consequences. And this can result in adolescents avoiding places or situations in which they think they're likely to panic, so maybe public transport or school. And this has a negative effect on their lives. But there are also additional negative effects for panic disorder on a greater scale, and it's linked to difficulties with social relationships, interactions, and academic functioning. And with this in mind, it's clear to see why it's just so important to further our understanding of this disorder. We especially need to study adolescents as an age group in their own right, rather than drawing assumptions based on studies of adults or younger children. And this is because adolescents are at a unique stage of development, and they differ from older and younger individuals in many ways, neurologically, socially, and behaviourally. And this was the aim of our study. We wanted to learn more about dissociation, which is one of the more common features of panic attacks in adolescents. In fact, studies have reported that between a quarter and a half of young people experience dissociation during panic attacks, but it isn't often researched or featured in psychological interventions for panic. And what do we mean by dissociation? Well, there's quite a lot of debate surrounding the definition because it's a really complex construct which encompasses lots of different experiences, as you can see from the slide. And to add to this confusion, the same terms are sometimes used to refer to different concepts or different terms to describe the same concept. Although debated, it is generally agreed that dissociation can be experienced with respect to the self. This is called depersonalization, and some people describe it as feeling like they're viewing their lives from behind glass, or like they're in a dream. And it can also be experienced with respect to the outside world, where people feel detached or disconnected from their surroundings, and this is derealization. Like panic, these feelings of dissociation exist on a spectrum. Lots of us experience mild symptoms from time to time, maybe when we're tired or really stressed. But more severe dissociation is associated with psychopathology. Traditionally, it's been linked to trauma and PTSD, but it also plays a role in other conditions, including anxiety disorders. According to cognitive approaches, what separates benign from pathological dissociation is the way it's interpreted. So if you experience a feeling of detachment, but then you dismiss it and you move on without a second thought, it's unlikely to become a problem. But if you interpret this same feeling in a negative way, then it's more likely to lead to psychological difficulties. And there are lots of theories about dissociation. It could be a kind of shutting off response that occurs to stop you being overwhelmed by emotion. It might be related to anxiety sensitivity or an intolerance of emotion, or maybe more likely, it's a combination of all of those things and more. Common to a subset of dissociative experiences is a felt sense of anomaly, or FSA dissociation. This newer concept refers to a group of experiences that are characterized by a subjective sense of oddness or strangeness, a feeling that something isn't quite right within your body, mental content, perception, or experience of yourself, and it might manifest as feelings of detachment, unfamiliarity, unreality, or lack of control. And on the slide, there are some of the items from the Chernis Felt Sense of Anomaly scale, which addresses these sensations. As I mentioned, dissociation is commonly reported by young people with panic disorder. And this is highlighted by this quote from a recent qualitative study. Here, one teenager describes how during a panic attack, she sometimes feels like she's not there or like she's dreaming. In our project, we were interested in exactly this experience. We wanted to know about the nature of the relationship between dissociation and panic symptoms in adolescence and some of the potential mediating factors. And the first of these potential mediators was expressive suppression. We know that our emotions shape our experiences, interactions, and well-being, and that being able to regulate our emotions is linked to our psychological health. And this is especially true for young people because according to the imbalance model of brain development, the neural circuitry of the adolescent brain is dominated by the emotion processing systems, which develop at a faster rate and are not effectively downregulated by the prefrontal regions which develop later on. And this imbalance then interacts with genetic and environmental risk factors, meaning that adolescents are less able to manage their emotions and therefore more likely to develop psychological disorders than older adults. In panic disorder in particular, we know that people often bottle up their emotions and they might suppress their expression of emotions in order to hide their panic symptoms from others. This expressive suppression is an emotion regulation strategy. It's the inhibition or concealment of emotionally expressive behaviours, so keeping your feelings to yourself or controlling your feelings by not showing them. We all suppress our emotions in certain situations, but it becomes a problem when it's used without flexibility or as a habit. As I mentioned earlier, it could be considered a safety behaviour under cognitive models, and it has a paradoxical effect. The more you try to control or suppress your emotions or sensations as a way of reducing anxiety, the more anxious you're likely to feel. Expressive suppression has also been linked to dissociation, potentially because it results in a kind of discrepancy between what you're feeling on the inside and what you're displaying on the outside. And this could lead to feelings of detachment, something which overlaps on a conceptual level with felt sense of anomaly dissociation. It's important to note here that just as habitual expressive suppression could lead to dissociation, it's equally possible that dissociation hinders emotion regulation. These two could be risk factors for each other, as both are linked to difficulties responding adaptively to internal sensations and emotional states. Adolescents are particularly likely to engage in expressive suppression because they experience quite intense emotions and they're often really worried about being judged negatively by others. And this is highlighted really clearly in another quote from Baker and colleagues' study. This young person describes how trying to hide her panic from other people to avoid negative judgment actually makes this panic worse. And the second potential mediator that we explored in our study was cognitive reappraisal. This is an adaptive regulation strategy, which refers to changing the way you think about an internal or an external situation in a way that reduces its negative emotional impact. For example, you might adopt a third-person perspective to give yourself some distance from an emotional situation, or think of a different interpretation for something that's upsetting. It's been linked to less dissociation in adults, and it's similar to cognitive restructuring, a process that lies at the heart of cognitive behavioural approaches to panic disorder. In our real-life example, this refers to the fact that the young person having a panic attack interprets feelings of dissociation in a negative way, but they don't reappraise them in a manner that makes them less threatening. And without this reappraisal, the belief that that feeling is dangerous persists, and so do panic symptoms. We predicted that there would be a positive relationship between dissociative experiences at the first time point and panic symptoms reported 1 month later. We predicted that this relationship would be mediated by emotion regulation strategies, so more dissociation and panic symptoms would be linked with more expressive suppression and less cognitive reappraisal. We also predicted that these same relationships would exist cross-sectionally, but in this presentation I'll just focus on the longitudinal data because it gives us a richer insight. And we conducted our study with a community sample, and we were able to do this because, as I mentioned earlier, panic symptoms exist on this sliding scale in the general population, with around 2/3 of young people reporting panic experiences on a yearly basis. So although the majority of young people who participated wouldn't have met the clinical threshold for a diagnosis of panic disorder, on a group level, they experienced enough of its symptoms to allow for a meaningful analysis. We recruited 13 to 18-year-olds by social media. They completed one set of questionnaires on Qualtrics, and then 1 month later, they completed that same set of questionnaires for a second time. Before conducting the study, we engaged a young person in a PPI consultation because measures of dissociation can be quite complicated, and we wanted to check that they could be understood by younger readers. And as a result, we made some small changes to the vocabulary. So, for example, we replaced the word automaton with the word robot in the depersonalization scale. We used the Panic Disorder Severity Scale to assess the frequency of panic symptoms, the distress and anticipatory anxiety that they cause, the fear associated with these symptoms, and the level of impairment that they bring. And we used the cognitive reappraisal and expressive suppression subscales of a version of the emotion regulation questionnaire which has been adapted for use in younger populations. And finally, we used the Chernis Felt Sense of Anomaly scale and the Cambridge Depersonalization scale to measure dissociation. By having two different measures rather than just one, we were able to capture a broader range of dissociative experiences. And so we conducted two mediation analyses, one with FSA dissociation as the predictor and one with depersonalization as the predictor variable. We had a really good response with over 8,000 young people clicking on the advert at the first time point and over 1,000 providing usable data at this stage. 1 month later, 421 adolescents gave responses that could be included on the Chernis Felt Sense of Anomaly scale. Slightly fewer provided usable data on the Cambridge Depersonalization scale due to an issue with the survey, but we did still have a sample size of 229 for that analysis. Our sample had a mean age of about 16.5 and around 70% of participants identified as female. Around 3/4 reported their ethnicity as white British, and over 60% reported having at least one parent with a professional occupation. So in the future, it would be beneficial to repeat this research, but with a more diverse sample with respect to gender, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. Preliminary data screening showed a small degree of heteroskedasticity, and so we used a bootstrapping mediation technique because it's more robust. So we used the process macro for SPSS, and 95% confidence intervals were calculated based on 5,000 bootstrap samples. And here are the descriptive statistics. So we had high levels of internal consistency for all measures, and as you can see, the scores on the questionnaires were relatively stable across the 2 time points. The mean panic score in our sample was approximately 9. To give you some context, previous research with clinical populations of adolescents with anxiety disorders has reported a mean of about 13. So although we did find, as we predicted, lower levels in our community sample, overall the score was still high enough to give meaningful results. And here we have the results from the analysis which had depersonalization as the predictor variable. So we found that greater depersonalization at time 1 predicted more severe panic symptoms at time 2. Depersonalization was associated with more expressive suppression, which in turn related to more severe panic symptoms. And more depersonalization related to less cognitive reappraisal, which in turn was associated with more severe panic symptoms. And both emotion regulation strategies were partial mediators of this longitudinal relationship between depersonalization and panic symptoms. The second analysis replaced depersonalization with FSA dissociation as the predictor variable. We found again that greater FSA dissociation predicted greater panic symptoms 1 month later, and it related to more expressive suppression, which in turn related to more severe panic symptoms. And as in the previous analysis, FSA dissociation was linked to less cognitive reappraisal, which in turn was associated with more severe panic symptoms. And once again, those 2 emotion regulation strategies partially mediated this relationship between dissociation and panic. The finding that both types of dissociative experience were related to more severe panic symptoms reported in the following month is consistent with previous findings in both adolescent and adult populations. But one more novel finding from our study was the partial mediation of expressive suppression of this relationship. So it appears that young people who experience more dissociation are more likely to bottle up their emotions, and they report more panic symptoms in the following month. Under a cognitive approach, this level of expressive suppression could be considered as a safety behaviour. Adolescents might become apprehensive of dissociative experiences if they've previously been linked with panic, and therefore attempt to control or suppress those feelings of dissociation as a way of avoiding or coping with that panic. It's important to highlight here that the measures of dissociation and emotion regulation that we used in this analysis were collected at the same point in time. So it's possible that the presence of dissociation prevents effective emotion processing, but alternatively, it could be the case that the act of suppressing emotions results in discrepancy between inner and outer experiences, which then triggers this feeling of detachment or dissociation. And so we would need to research that further to fully explore the nature of this relationship. We found that cognitive reappraisal is likely a more adaptive emotion regulation strategy, as more dissociation and panic were related to less use of cognitive reappraisal. So this implies that young people who don't change their thinking to reinterpret feelings of dissociation in a way that reduces their negative emotional impact are more likely to experience panic symptoms. This finding can be interpreted under a cognitive framework, and these highlight the role of cognitive appraisals in the formation and maintenance of psychopathological symptoms. If dissociation is interpreted as an indication of some sort of mental catastrophe like losing control, and there's no cognitive reappraisal, anxiety is likely to rise, and this can then in turn heighten that feared dissociation sensation. But we would need experimental evidence to confirm if dissociation is not just comorbid with panic symptoms, but actually plays a causal role in their occurrence. And of course, our results need to be evaluated in light of the strengths and the weaknesses of our study. Our large community sample means that our findings provide important insight into adolescents' experiences of panic and dissociation in the general population. As I previously mentioned, we had an overrepresentation, particularly of female participants. This is consistent with prevalence data showing that anxiety disorders are slightly more common in females. But regardless, future research would benefit from including a more diverse sample. Additionally, we know that dissociation is really complex, and we can think of it as a type of umbrella term that encompasses lots of different experiences. And we were able to better reflect this by looking at 2 different subtypes. But we should bear in mind that the experiences of clinical populations might be qualitatively different to those studied here. And we only researched 2 emotion regulation strategies out of a wide repertoire of techniques that adolescents make use of. So in future, assessing more of these strategies might be beneficial, particularly for patient groups who might regulate their emotions in other ways, so for example by catastrophizing or ruminating. And obviously we would need to replicate our results in a clinical population before any suggestion could be made with respect to treatment. But our findings do lend preliminary support to the benefits of targeting emotion regulation in therapy for panic. And this aligns with existing literature, which suggests that learning to navigate strong feelings is key during adolescence, and that during this stage of life, our cognitive abilities develop to allow us to do so. It might be the case that young people with panic disorder just require a little bit more help learning to understand and manage their emotions. There might be a benefit of some psychoeducation. By teaching young people that these feelings of dissociation are normal and harmless, that likelihood of a catastrophic interpretation could reduce. To further our understanding and lend more support to these inferences, we've since written a further paper which used data from this study and a parallel student project. We looked not just at emotion regulation strategies, but also alexithymia, and importantly, we assessed the specific nature of problematic cognitive appraisals of dissociation. This paper, which is currently available as a preprint, found that cognitive reappraisal was a partial mediating variable, and so were negative interpretations of dissociation, which we assessed using the Cognitive Appraisals of Dissociation and Psychosis questionnaire. This measure has items relating to concerns about dissociative experiences being inherently dangerous, signs of threat or losing control of your body or mind, and negative beliefs about yourself. So these findings lend further support to this cognitive behavioural interpretation that I mentioned earlier, in which dissociative experiences that are persistently misinterpreted in a catastrophic way could lead to more anxiety and panic, and this could then in turn both maintain and heighten that feared dissociation feeling. The Cognitive Appraisals of Dissociation in Psychosis measure also includes items relating to negative beliefs about yourself, which don't usually feature in cognitive models of panic. So this finding opens an avenue for future research, as negative self-beliefs have been reported in qualitative accounts of panic disorder in young people, and they might be especially relevant for adolescents who are at this really key stage of identity development in their lives. And I'd like to finish with a thank you to everyone here today for taking the time to listen to my presentation, and especially to my amazing supervisors, Polly and Emma, for their continuing help and support. Yeah, I think, so if you had a clinical group of people with panic disorder, we know that it's quite associated with a real focus, like self-focus of attention. So with that in mind, it might be quite likely that individuals with panic disorder would be more likely to notice these feelings of dissociation. And they're also more likely to have this kind of catastrophic thinking style, particularly related to physical sensations. So I think you'd also be a lot more likely to notice higher scores on things like the cognitive appraisals of dissociation in psychosis measure. And I think it would also be worth looking at different emotion regulation strategies. So we know, obviously, we've done expressive suppression and cognitive reappraisal in the community sample, but in addition, it might be good to look at things like ruminating or maybe catastrophizing.
I'll share. It's really impressive talk, and especially impressive that you're able to collect such large data samples and longitudinal data in the context of an undergraduate project. I wonder if you could say anything about the potential challenges in recruiting these large samples through social media and getting them to come back in a month's time. Do you think there's anything different about the people who do come back and provide that second data set compared to people who are lost along the way?
Yep, that was something. We did have quite a big dropout rate. We had also quite a few people who sort of clicked on the link and then maybe didn't provide data going forwards, but we still managed to have quite big sample sizes, and we did actually do a chi-square test just to check that the people who provided data at time 1 weren't significantly different in terms of demographics at time 2. So I think the only difference from memory there was that there was a very slight age difference, so people who provided data at both time points were a little bit older. But in terms of recruitment, we did social media advertising. I think we did Twitter, Instagram and Facebook. And then sort of have a bit of an incentive. We had the option of entering a prize draw for people who did both time points. But we did have a really good response, so we were quite lucky with that.
Thank you.
Hi, brilliant talk. I was an undergrad at Oxford a few years ago, so it's nice sort of seeing the great work that's going on there. Didn't win a prize. That's up to you. I just wanted to ask about the kind of ordering of the different constructs, because it occurs to me that a lot of the time we talk about psychology, we talk about sort of cycles of maintenance and so on, and actually in the introduction, I wondered whether you're going to be predicting dissociation from panic, and then in the end the model was predicting panic from dissociation. And I wonder if people are nodding along here, either if we were to assume it replicates measuring them the other way around in time, or even having a 3-time point design where you sort of see whether the ball bounces back, as it were, a month later. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I think that was kind of something that we had kind of thinking about what would be really good to do again, was having extra time points or maybe bigger gaps between time points, because we also only had 1 month. The reason we did it the way round that we did is because we sort of looked at the cognitive model of panic and then the model of depersonalization disorder. And both of those kind of have the trigger for the panic attack, if you like, of this internal sensation. So in our case, this feeling of dissociation and that triggering the panic attack, which is why we did it this way round. But I think absolutely right. It would have been really interesting to see if the same was happening in reverse, kind of more of like a cyclical thing.
I had a quick question about the ages. So first, it's quite a wide age range, 12 to 18. I wondered if you looked at whether these effects might change with age. Does that?
We didn't sort of divide that up anymore, but I think going forward that would be that's a really good point, because there's a big difference between a 13-year-old and an 18-year-old. And actually we had more older individuals in our study. But yeah, there could be quite a big difference, not just in terms of kind of developmentally, but actually socially, where people are between 13 and 18. So absolutely good. I think that would have been really interesting had we had a little bit more time to do so. It would have been nice to look at whether that was different with different age groups.
Thank you. And then just leading on from that, because you mentioned at the beginning you justified focusing on adolescents as previous work has focused on children or adults, and we can't assume the same is true in the adolescents. So how then do you think that your data was different from, for example, adults?
I think what we've found in sort of adolescence is that there's more of a focus on maybe the social consequences. So they have this feeling of being detached or spaced out, but actually one of the major concerns from that is, which has been shown in some of the qualitative studies that I found there, with that then they're quite worried about what other people are judging them for. So that's slightly different from adult populations, but I think there's a lot more work you could do there to see if there's any maybe other cognitive interpretations that are more specific to adolescents that we weren't able to capture with these.
Time for questions if people have them.
Yeah, that is confusing, the cognitive reappraisal and cognitive appraisals. So cognitive reappraisal, so you had more dissociation at the first time point, was related to less use of cognitive reappraisal, so that's less reinterpretation of a negative feeling or emotion in a way that makes it less threatening. Whereas the cognitive appraisals of dissociation, that's things like believing that a feeling of dissociation is an indication of a sign of losing control or losing your mind. So that's slightly different, rather than the reappraisal is this kind of reinterpretation process.
I guess I'm just wondering, realistically, it's quite hard to reappraise that situation, especially when there is no psychoeducation around any of that. Would you actually expect anyone to kind of dissociate and be like, okay, let me try to see this in a different way, let me try to manage this in a different way? I don't know.
I think probably we'd be looking at somewhere like on a scale, so depending on how severe the dissociation was to begin with, also the context in which it occurs. So if you're really tired or something, you might come up with a different interpretation, think, oh, that's a little bit strange, but maybe it's because I'm tired or stressed or something. Whereas in more like severe cases or people who have panic disorder, then that focus goes on to that feeling, and that's when kind of it escalates a bit more.
I think that brings us to the end, and we say congratulations again to Lottie for a fantastic talk. Well so we now have about 15-20-minute break when we'll return at 4:30 for our EPS President's Address with Catherine Ratfield. So back in this room here in about 15